Welcome. Welcome everybody to this last day of the Future Week. My name is Lennart Olsson. I come from Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. And for the next 45 minutes to 1 hour, I will talk about what I think is one of the absolutely most important transformation at the global scale that I'm looking forward to see within my lifetime. That's how close it is, I think. We're not talking about something which will take centuries. It can be done within decades if we are really, if we are persistent and if we are serious about it. But there are many factors, many forces out there who would not like to see this transformation happening. So I will talk about a transformation from annual monocultures to perennial polycultures. There was a very important paper about 10 years ago by Jonathan Foley, and he described agriculture as the most environmental destructive activity humanity ever invented. It's responsible for about a third of the emission of greenhouse gases. It is the main reason for destruction of biodiversity, for deforestation. It's a major factor in polluting our oceans. It's a major factor for releasing toxic substance to the environment. And if we think very carefully about what makes agriculture so extremely damaging, is there one particular thing that it can boil down to? And if we do that, we will probably find that the reliance on annual species, that is the main factor causing this unsustainability. In the beginning, something like 10,000 years ago, in this part of the world, people started to domesticate grasses and legumes, and they were all annuals. There are good reasons why they domesticated annuals. They were easier to domesticate, and both for genetic reasons and for more sort of plant physiological reasons, because they come in and they grow and then they die and they reproduce themselves through seeds. So you can pick seeds and then you can plant seeds, the best seeds, and it will be a new generation. Perennial grasses, perennial species, were much, much more difficult to domesticate. So there's no surprise that that was what we started with. And if we look today, after 10,000 years, it's amazing what we have been able to do with the plant species. We have changed them in all kinds of ways. The shape, the taste, the size, everything can be changed. And here is an interesting, which I think we should keep in mind for the discussion later on. A friend of mine who is an ecologist who is working very closely with plant breeders. He said much of the knowledge for plant breeding is ecological knowledge. But we have to use the mind of a plant breeder because the mind of an ecologist is really problematic. Having said this, he said that ecologists are usually looking at the average. When you take a group of individuals, ecology will single out, that's an outlier, that's not interesting. The outliers, they are not interesting for an ecologist who are interested to pursue knowledge about ecological processes. But the plant breeder says, that's an outlier, that's a really, really interesting individual, I can do something with that. So this, I think, is a really struggle, how to use ecological understanding, ecological theory the best we can, but using this sort of plant breeder's mind. Watch for the outliers and see how you can use them for creating something useful. So overall, in the world, we say that about 80% of the global food supply comes from annual species. And they make up 60 to 80% of the global cropland. And the fact that they're annuals means that every year, or in some cases twice a year, we have to uproot the crops. We have to terminate all the ecological processes in the field. And in this part of the world, we even turn the soil upside down almost every year. And of course, that's extremely detrimental to the life in the soil and all the ecological processes. So the main, sort of the founding father of the idea of changing agriculture from annuals to perennials is Wes Jackson. He wrote this, he formulated his ideas in his first book, New Roots for Agriculture. I think it came out in late 70s or 1980 perhaps. And he was interested to look at what is it that makes a natural ecosystem so resilient in terms of climate and in terms of pests and so forth, and so productive. And he boiled it down to two things. They're dominated by perennial crops which have large and deep root systems, and they are diverse in space. Diversity is something which we have figured out in agriculture. It's very important. But we often have diversity over time rather than in space. Diversity in time means that we have crop rotations. We have figured out that's a very good practice to reduce the problems of pests and also keep more healthy soils. But in nature, we usually have diversity in space. Polyculture instead of monocultures. So these were the two things that Wes Jackson identified. And then he said also, this will probably take some time. It will take more than 50 years to develop these perennial polycultures, the perennial species that can grow in polyculture. But we will do it within less than 100 years, he said. And of course, 100 years, that's an extremely short time span, given that we have been using the annuals for 10,000 years. Now, after something like 45 years, Wes Jackson it's absolutely clear that 50 years was much closer to the 100 years. We've already seen the first perennial grain crops being domesticated, and some of them have even been released to the as commercial species. Diversity in space, sort of polyculture, that's equally important as the perennial species. So, I'm going to talk about these 4 points, starting with the many problems of annuals, and then talking about the solutions and co-benefits in the theory, and then describe the research front, where we are at the moment, and how long time it will take, and then describe what sort of the research landscape looks like. And I will end with a wishful thinking for what we can do here at Lund University, together with others. We'll see. So, as I started with, we have many problems. There are many problems related to agriculture, but this is one, I think, which is particularly interesting. We have over 400 dead zones in the oceans, and they are primarily dependent or caused by agriculture. And think about the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is one, or the Baltic Sea has several of them, or you can say that Baltic Sea is perhaps one big dead zone. Sweden has the longest coastline, by far, but we have a rather small contribution to the problems in the Baltic Sea. Most of the problem comes from other countries. And we have very, very small possibilities to influence the agricultural practices in Poland, Germany, the Baltic states, Russia, and so forth. But if we can contribute to developing plants that are so attractive to the farmers that they shift to using these ones, and that will reduce the leaching of nutrients and the use of pesticides, that will have a tremendous impact on the Baltic. So maybe we could even say that without a shift to perennial polycultures, we cannot save the Baltic Sea. Some problems of annual monocultures. The first one is erosion. Erosion might not be seen as such a big problem by most lay people. Some people think it's mainly a problem in developing countries, like Ethiopia, where erosion is an incredible problem. But even in our part of the world, studies in the US has shown that conventional agriculture, where we have conventional tillage, plowing and harrowing and so forth, there we have erosion which is 2 to 3 orders of magnitude faster than the natural regeneration of soil. So soil is a renewable resource. It's not sort of a fossil, it's renewable, but it's very slowly renewable. So in conventional agriculture, we're losing soil 2 to 3 orders of magnitude faster than it is created. And of course, in the long run, that is unsustainable. Nutrients. We have an agricultural system. The conventional agricultural system is dependent on adding nutrients. But we lose many of them. About 50% of all the nitrogen that we apply is lost. Most of it through the water and some to the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, it contributes to climate change because it's released as nitrous oxide. When it's lost to the water, it contributes to the eutrophication and the pollution of our waters and seas around. And it's expensive, of course, for farmers to buy all these fertilizers. Carbon. When we first started to change a natural ecosystem into an agricultural field, we lost lots and lots of carbon that was stored in the soil as organic matter. Between 40, 50, up to 80% of the soil organic matter has been lost in agricultural fields compared to the natural ecosystem it was. And of course, that is a problem because the carbon goes up in the atmosphere and contributes substantially to climate change. Weeds. Many people think perhaps that weeds is some kind of a natural phenomenon, but it isn't. It is to a very large extent produced by us, produced by the fact that we have annual crops that are really invited. Once a year, we invite the weeds. We open up the fields. There's no competition whatsoever. It's free for all the weeds to jump in and start to establish themselves. I'll talk more about weeds later on when we're talking about the difference between annuals and perennial species. And so what we have an agricultural system that is dependent on taking away weeds using, to a large extent, biochemicals. And that is probably the main reason, the main factor. The use of various pesticides, and particular herbicides, is a major reason for this incredible loss of insects and pollinators in particular, perhaps. There were studies in Germany recently showing that something like 70% of the insects have disappeared over the last 5 decades. With perennial polycultures, you never invite the weeds, really, because the ground is covered 12 months a year. And energy. Agriculture is extremely energy demanding. In conventional agriculture, the farmer drives his or her tractor across the field 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times per season. And that's sort of a 2 tons machinery that needs to be driven many kilometers back and forth. And of course, that's energy demanding and expensive for the farmers. And almost every spring in Sweden, we see pictures like this. That is very difficult. The spring is extremely stressful period for farmers because they need to do so many things and they're dependent on the weather. If it's too wet, they can't do much, or they get stuck, and it's even worse. So there are many, many problems associated with the use of annuals when we think about it. So if we talk to a farmer, what he or she would think about having perennial crops, he could list enormous, long list of advantages. There are also social problems related to our use of annuals. So why do I show a Volvo PV? Because I would like to make a comparison between agriculture and car making. If we have a car maker like Volvo, they don't make all the pieces themselves. They have many, many subcontractors. But they are in charge of the design. They determine what inputs do we need to our car in terms of gearboxes, seat belts, airbags, and so forth. So if we had a car where the subcontractors were responsible for designing the car, I think that car would look rather different. But in agriculture, we actually have a situation where the subcontractors are to a large extent determining what the final product looks like, the food. You have the seed industry, you have the chemical industry, you have the machinery industry, and fertilizer industry. They determine what the final product is like. And farmers are extremely caught in what has been called the Agriculture Treadmill. This is a theory that was formulated by the American agricultural economist Willard Cochrane in 1958. And it is very much, it's still very valid. So in essence, the theory is like this. There is a new device. In 1958, it was primarily about machinery, so a tractor or a combiner or something like that. Then there are, at the arrow up there, we have non-risk-averse early adopters. Usually farmers, big fields, big farm, with a lot of resources. Well-educated, they have capital. So they invest in this. That means that they are increasing the efficiency, increasing the output. But of course, an effect of increasing output is, of course, we have declining price of the produce. Per kilogram, the price goes down, which means that you have to have larger areas with your new efficient machinery, and you need more capital. And if you're not the early adopters who could fund this themselves, you have to perhaps go and borrow the money in the bank, and farmers become indebted. And then they have to, so the latecomers, they don't enter this agriculture treadmill because they want to do it necessarily, but they have to do it in order to stay in business. So this agriculture treadmill is really driving the unsustainability of agriculture. And if we look at farming around, in Europe, in North America, farmers are very, very highly indebted. It's a group of people with very, very high debts. They have very, very low income. In Sweden, if you take the average hours the farmers work and divide by the income, they will have an hourly income of something between 60 and 120 kroner per hour. And these are people who are sort of experienced, they have been in the business for a long time, and they have families and so forth. And the hourly salary is extremely low. I think when we ask students to help us, they will get 120 krona per hour. So there are a number of social problems associated with the use of annual grains as well. And if we look at this graph showing the kind of illustration of the agriculture treadmill. So in the dark green, I should have a pointer. Anyhow, the dark green, that shows the value or the price of the food grains the farmer will produce. You can see that the relative price has gone down. It was 1980 was 100%, and is now in 2016 or 17 it was 50%. So farmers are getting less and less money for their produce. And then the thin lines, they are the costs of inputs. So the upper one, that is the seeds. That have the seeds have on average gone up by between 250 and 300%. We have the herbicides. Thank you. So that's the produce, the grain they produce. That's the cost of seeds, the cost of pesticides, the cost of fertilizers, and here we have the machinery and energy has been sort of more or less the same, but particularly the seeds and the pesticides. So this shows how farmers actually, this widening gap is a very, very big problem, and it is driven by the fact that farmers need to go and buy the seeds every year. And the annual systems also requires the herbicides every year and so forth. We could talk about rural societies here as well. We all know that rural areas are considered by many to be boring. There is no social life. There's no cinema in the local village, or no restaurants, and people are moving away from rural areas. But maybe one day, if we have a transformation to perennial crops, farmers would need to spend much less time managing the farms. They would need to spend much less money on buying external inputs. So a conventional farmer in North America will pay up to 85% of the gross income to buy these external inputs. And that is, of course, money that goes right away from the local economy. It goes to the seed industry and the agrochemical industry somewhere else. It will not really benefit the local economy. But if farmers could drastically reduce the cost of production and get more time, that would give rise to a completely different local economy. So that's the vision, that by 2050 or 60, we will have libraries and cinemas and restaurants coming back into the rural villages. Okay, the solutions and the co-benefits. In theory, why are these perennial varieties so much better? If we look in principle, what a wild annual plant will look like before domestication, have lots of stems, fairly large root system, but shallow. The early annual grain crops, let's say after 1,000, 2,000 years of selection, they have increased the heads of these ones. They are more useful to people, but you see that the root system starts to decline. And the modern annual grain crops looks like this. One stem, one head, and a very limited root system. The wild perennials, they look like this. They look pretty messy. And the idea is to have perennial grain crops that look a little bit like the annual grain crops above, but they have kept the root system below. So let's talk about some ecological theory. An ecologist, John Grime, formulated a theory in the 1970s that plants, they have three types of plants out there. They have three typical competitive advantages. One, and you can group them in this triangular diagram. So there are the competitors. These are plants that have various mechanisms to outcompete others. So for example, a typical oak tree is a good example of a competitor. They have an enormous, the tree canopy is very large, and they protect their space around. Nobody can come in there to establish themselves because the oak has taken all the light, for example. Other trees may have mechanisms for polluting or creating some kind of a chemical environment around them, which is unappealing for others. So some species are good at outcompeting others. In this corner, John Grimes said we have the stress-tolerant species. Species that have a particular advantage that they can thrive even under extreme stress. The best example is, of course, a cactus. Because the cactus has a particular way of opening and closing their stomata. Stomata are small holes on the leaves they need to open up to suck in carbon dioxide. But every time you open up these stomata, the small holes, water also escapes. That's a big problem. That's how plants lose their water. But the cactus, they have invented a particular way of doing it. They can open the stomata only at night and suck in the carbon, and then keep the carbon inside the leaves, and then during the day, they can take the energy from the sun and the stored carbon. By that, they can survive in places where no other plant can survive, because other plants will lose water. So that's a typical stress-tolerant. Or we have salt-tolerant species. We have all kinds of species down in this corner. And then we have this corner, this type, the third type that John Grimes talked about. That's the ruderals. Ruderals, they are species. Their competitive advantage is they are very, very quick at establishing themselves. So, for example, when you have a natural disturbance, if we could talk about the natural ecosystem, a natural disturbance like a fire, landslide, or something like that, when the ecosystem is severely disturbed, so all others have disappeared, then they can come in and establish themselves very, very quickly, and they almost all of them are annuals. So their idea is the seed comes in, they develop a root system, a small root system, just enough for them to grow a plant that can produce a seed, and then drop the seed, and that's it. Now, all the species that we have, not all, but most of the annuals that we have domesticated, they are of the ruderal type. Because if you think about a disturbed ecosystem, can you think of a more disturbed ecosystem than an agricultural field? I mean, landslides, they happen, but maybe that's once every 50, every 100 years. Fires also happen, but in our part of the world, we may have a fire every 200, every 300 years. But in agriculture, we severely disturb the ecosystem every year, once a year. It's the most disturbed ecosystem you can think of. And that's why the ruderals are really good. But this also means that the ruderals are not very good at competing with others. For example, weeds, for example, with various pests. They are not very good at tolerating stress, not very good at, for example, sucking up nutrients under poor conditions, anything like that. That hasn't been a problem in agriculture because we solved the lack of competitor traits. We solved that by taking away everything else, either by chemicals or mechanically. All the competition we remove. And the stress tolerance, we supply all the nutrients they need, so they don't need to be particularly good at sucking up the nutrients or something like that. So ruderals, that's what we have cultivated for the last 10,000 years. So if we look at them, this is from John Grimes' paper in 1977, where it's annual herbs. They're in this corner, the ruderal corner. And that's what we have domesticated. What we would like is, of course, perennial herbs and ferns. They are spread out all over. We would like to have species that have ability of a little bit of everything. So that's ecological theory telling us that perennial plants should be much better to base our agriculture on. If we want to reduce the amount of chemicals, if we want to reduce the amount of fertilizers we spread on, and so forth. Another thing is if we think about soil as biology. Many people may think of soil as primarily something physical. It's chemistry and physics, but it's primarily biology. And there has been a very, in science, I think we have seen a very significant trend of understanding soil as a biological thing rather than a physical. If you ask an old soil scientist, they don't have a clue about microbiota. If you ask a modern soil scientist, it's all about microbiota. I know a couple of old soil scientists, so I've tested this. And of course, the soil, some people, if we talk about biodiversity, we all know that the rainforest is the most biodiverse ecosystem we can think of. Yes, if we are thinking about biodiversity above ground. But if we are thinking about biodiversity below ground, few places in the world can compete with the boreal forest in Skåne or in Sweden, for example. We have incredible biodiversity. And some of the microbiota are particularly important in a natural ecosystem. That's fungi, mycorrhiza. If you take a colleague of mine at the ecology department, Håkan Wallander, who is a modern soil scientist, he said once that if you take a teaspoon, I think it's a teaspoon, could be a bigger spoon. Anyhow, if you take a spoon of soil from a Swedish beech forest, for example, and you put it into the microscope, you will find over 1 kilometer of mycorrhiza threads in that. And they are extremely important. If you took away, if you made the soil in a forest sterile, the trees would not survive very long. They are extremely important for the biological life above ground. And in agricultural soils, there is very, very little soil biota because the frequent disturbance and the frequent use of very strong chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, insecticides, and also that we have bred the annual crops so that they don't need any soil biota any longer. Because if they are lousy in terms of taking up nutrients, that's not really a problem because we can always add the nutrients using synthetic fertilizer. That has been sort of the idea. So we have been able to mask the collapse of soil biota in our agricultural fields by adding nutrients. So this shows, in principle, without mycorrhiza, you have a plant and you have some roots. With mycorrhiza, you can increase the area of roots. It's like having another root system. So you increase the surface area of the root system by up to 1,000 times. There's 1,000 times more root area that can be active in, for example, picking up nutrients that are stored in the soils. The mycorrhiza is not only expanding the surface area to make it more sort of better at taking up nutrients, they also have chemical biological function, so they can transform some of the inaccessible nutrients and make them accessible to plants. And this is particularly important in a geopolitical question. You may have heard that the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize, this year went to Greta Thunberg, that's well known, but it went to another person also who has been fighting for the freedom of West Sahara. So what has West Sahara to do with mycorrhiza? Because Western Sahara is the place where over 80% of all the phosphates in the world are stored. And I think, many with me think, that the only reason why the international community is accepting Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara is that they think this is the best way to keep the phosphate mines open. Because with the current consumption of phosphates, primarily in agriculture, we will run out of phosphate around 2100. And without phosphate, there will be a serious food crisis. But if we go out in the field in an agriculture region like we are here, there's lots and lots of phosphate or phosphor in the soil, but it's inaccessible. The plants cannot take it up. They need things like mycorrhiza. Deep roots and mycorrhiza can probably make use of all these phosphate in the soil. So therefore, we can at least sort of extend we can delay sort of the collapse of agriculture due to lack of phosphor by a number of centuries, I hope. So mycorrhiza is the reason why we have virtually no mycorrhiza in agricultural field is because we disturb them frequently, we put so many chemicals on them, and we have bred plants that don't need mycorrhiza. So with perennials, we can start all over again with almost a natural kind of process and carefully breed something and keeping all these qualities. Another reason why we need perennials is how they handle water. Water is already in many places in the world a major limitation to agriculture. It will be so even more in most places. In a field, particularly a sloping field with annual crops, we have short growing season, we have shallow roots and low root density, which means that we have limited access, the plants have limited access to nutrients and water. We are losing a lot of water through runoff. The crop cover cannot absorb all the rain, especially if the rain comes in heavy showers, which is increasingly due to climate change. And the soil, there's not enough root system to really take it up. So we lose a lot of water by overland runoff and by drainage down to the groundwater, and it's lost. Having perennials with long growing season, when I say short growing season, we are using maybe 7 or 8 months of the growing season in normal annual plants. With perennials, we use 12 months of photosynthesis. They're all the time. They have a different root system. They can take up much more of the soil or of the water that goes into the soil. And they have much more of soil, of plant residues on the surface, which means that they reduce the runoff as well. So some people have argued that a problem with perennials is that they need more water to produce a crop than annual ones. And to some extent, it is correct, because there is more biomass. And of course, more biomass needs more water. But the extra water we need is primarily taken from reducing the losses. So from a water shortage point of view, that is not really a problem. And if we look at the soil carbon, here I'm showing a picture of a conventional wheat and a picture with a newly domesticated crop called Kernza. And this is a field from just outside Lennart. Linda Maria, who's here somewhere. Yes, it's your field, actually. And your colleague, Erik Jensen, standing in the middle of it. So if we put one of these devices out there that will measure continuously the flow of carbon dioxide or the exchange of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the ground, we can see that conventional wheat, winter wheat in this case, is a source of CO2, 6.5 to 8.2 tons of CO2 per hectare every year goes from the field up into the atmosphere. The studies we have, there are rather few studies, there are 3 studies so far yet on this domesticated plant. This is what it looks like. That is instead, we have seen 13.5 tons of CO2 per hectare a year that goes in the other direction. So it's a sink of carbon. Then, of course, it's all this carbon that goes into the field will not stay there indefinitely, of course. But there is a very good reason to believe that this is a field that will release more and more carbon the longer we use it, and this is a field that will capture, accumulate more and more carbon the longer we use it. So, to summarize, there are all these fantastic advantages. If they're so good, why aren't they developed? Wes Jackson coined the idea 45 years ago. And he's a very well-known character, written several books about it. Why hasn't this been done? Then I think that we need to look at the political economy of agriculture. If we start with a very big picture of agriculture, it is embedded in the world's largest market system, a market where we all participate. We have over 7 billion consumers, and we have about 1.5 billion producers. So a market with many, many, many people. But it is controlled by very, very, very few actors. And they are getting fewer and fewer every month, actually. So if we look at, we have the input companies, these are the ones that were sort of the subcontractors to agriculture. I think the Indian cotton agriculture, India is producing more cotton than any country in the world. I think there is one corporation responsible or having over 80% of the seed market. And that's not healthy. And if your business idea is to manage a problem, not solve it, but manage a problem, then you are very reluctant to solve that problem. And this is a brilliant business idea. So this is the business idea of herbicides. Because the more you use the herbicides, the bigger will the demand for herbicides be. So this shows the increase in glyphosate-resistant weeds worldwide. Glyphosate, that is the most commonly used herbicide in the world. When it's manufactured by Monsanto, it's called Roundup. You may have heard of Roundup. And this shows the number of species that are becoming resistant to this herbicide. And we see in 1990, I think it was released in 1993, something like that. So we could see only a few years later, we have the first resistance to glyphosate. And then it is an exponential increase. So of course, you need to have more and more herbicides. And now in the US, because the US has come further along this destructive path than European agriculture, they are talking about, they've already started to use combinations of 2 herbicides, because you need one herbicide, Roundup is one, and then you need another one to kill these ones. And USDA recently approved cocktails of 3 herbicides. You have 3 herbicides together. And of course, this will never end. It's a game we will never win. Evolution is always smarter than people. And the reason we have so much weeds that needs to be killed is, of course, the practice of using annual crops. To make things even worse, we can look at the phenomenal economic restructuration we have seen in the agrochemical industrial complex. I use this term, the agrochemical industrial complex. You may remember that Truman warned about the military industrial complex once upon a time. He said that was a very dangerous thing. It is when there is a very strong alliance between the political institutions and very large businesses in the field of military industry. And of course, there is a very strong, because the state is usually the one buying the weapons. And he warned about that already in the early 50s. But now I think we have a similar situation with agrochemical industrial complex. So we have, if we look at the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, their way of regulating pesticides, it is almost completely driven by the industry. So industry has regulation, and they have the regulation they want. Why does the industry want regulation for things like GMO, for chemicals, and so forth? There are two reasons. One reason is that it's easier to sell things that are considered dangerous if there's some kind of government approval. And secondly, if there will be problems in the end, that people will develop various diseases, cancers, and like that. It will reduce the liability of that company because there was a government who had approved it. So therefore, it's really in the interest of the chemical industry to have government regulation, but they want to control it. So what we have seen now over the last, this picture says 1996 to 2018, but this is sort of the consolation. It has actually accelerated in the last decade only. So it shows in red, we have chemical industries, very, very large chemical industries. And in blue, we have seed industries. Small, they're usually small, and they do plant breeding. And then in green, we have a few green ones. They are other farm equipment manufacturers. But it's primarily that this chemical industry, they have bought up almost the entire seed industry. And why? Well, there's a logic to it. If you want to sell your agrochemicals, the best way is, of course, to make sure that the seeds are suitable for your chemicals. So the biggest selling seed, or we can say the fastest uptake of an innovation, I think, definitely in the field of agriculture, but I think it's in all sectors, is the uptake of something called Roundup Ready seeds in the US. We don't use them in Europe, thanks to we have still a kind of regulation that is not completely owned by the industry. But in the US, we have the Roundup Ready seed is a seed that is genetically modified, so it's resistant to the herbicide Roundup, which means that farmers can plant the field with this Roundup Ready seed and spray it, entire field, with Roundup. Everything will die except the seed that has been modified to be resistant. And this has increased the use of herbicide or of glyphosate exponentially since we developed this seed. And I think about 80% of the soybean acreage in the US is now Roundup Ready. And this has happened over in something like less than 10 years. So we very seldom see such a rapid adoption of a new technology. And of course, there is a perfect match between the owner of the seed industry and the chemical industry. So Bayer here is a German, very large industrial chemistry conglomerate. They, about a year ago, they bought up Monsanto, which is this little, many people think that Monsanto is a big company, but in terms of, compared to Bayer, it is a small one. But the advantage for Bayer to have Monsanto was to have enormous, they control very large, many seed companies. Because seed companies and chemical companies, that's a perfect match as a business idea. We also saw that Syngenta, which is here, a big European-based chemical industry, controlling many seed companies, they were bought up by a Chinese chemical company. So why did the chemical ChemChina, why did they buy Syngenta? Most people believe that the Chinese are much more planning ahead than Europeans and American companies. And Syngenta is the company with its seed operations, a very strong presence in Africa. So it was a way for ChemChina to gain market access to China. It was much cheaper, easier to do it like this than start to develop their own network. And of course, if we look a couple of decades ahead, Africa will be a major region for agricultural technologies. And this is a new company that it was created a year and a half ago by the merger of Dow and DuPont. There are a few independent seed companies here. We have a French one, we have a German one, we have a Danish one, who do not have an institutional connection to the chemical industry, at least, which is good. But they are subject to a lot of pressure, of course, and you never know when they will be bought up, because that's the trend. What is happening now is, of course, you may have read the news in newspapers about Bayer. Some people actually talking about Bayer fighting for their existence because they bought Monsanto. And this is where the regulation didn't really work the way Monsanto wanted it to be. Because Monsanto is now being sued by, the latest figure I saw, that was a few days ago, 18,300 people are standing in the queue of suing Monsanto for their Roundup has caused cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or something like that. It's a very severe form of cancer. 4 cases have already been finished, and they have lost all 4 of them. And the fine, first I think the fine was set to $2 billion, but then it was reduced to I think about $30 million. But $30 million multiplied by 18,300 is a big number. So even Bloomberg News, which is one of the biggest business intelligence companies in the world, they are actually speculating, will Bayer survive that they bought Monsanto? And I hope that this will be a wake-up call for at least Europe, because Bayer is a German company, that we cannot continue with this extremely chemical agriculture. Another thing, when we look at who is controlling the agricultural development, there is something which is extremely important, both for the producers of food themselves, but also for everybody else: diversity. This is what is it? Probably alfalfa field in Nebraska. And this is a field in England. Which landscape would you prefer? If we see landscape is something more than just a place where you produce food. If we recognize there are other values to the landscape than just being sort of a source of food, we would like to have diversity. And of course, the diversity, or the lack of diversity, is to a large extent driven by the farm machinery, farm equipment industry. With these enormous machines, you cannot have hedgerows, streams zigzagging over the field, and so forth. So the research front. The biggest success, that's rice, perennial rice. It has already been released. It has been out where farmers have been able to buy it commercially for, I think, a year. No, I think earlier this year. So it's not even a year when the two first perennial versions were released. And perennial rice has been achieved. It's a crossbreeding of Oryza sativa, which is the common domesticated rice, Asian rice, which is grown. That's the most common rice, and Oryza longistaminata, a cousin, you can say, to this one, a wild cousin, which comes from Africa. It was taken to the US many decades ago, where it is seen as a very, very, very bad weed. But breeding the domesticated annual with the wild perennial made it possible to create a perennial rice. And of course, in rice, which is extremely labor intensive, very complicated to grow, a perennial one would have many, many advantages. So the yield after 7 seasons, there hasn't been any reduction in the yield, and it yields on par with annuals. Something like the last season was 9 tons per hectare, which is a very, very good yield, slightly higher than comparable annual ones. There was definitely great economic return to the farmers because it was cheaper to operate. The milling qualities exceeded annual cultivars, and the taste was really good. I've tasted myself. I have 10 kilos at home. The research question, of course, one is methane nitrous oxide emission, because rice is a very problematic crop for climate change. That's a major source of methane, which is the second most important greenhouse gas after CO2. We think that perennial rice will be able to reduce substantially the emission of methane. I think about a third of all the methane emission we have in the world comes from rice. So that's significant. But then we have also to look at the nitrous oxide emission, so it's not that trivial. The next one is perennial wheat-like, and I think that we should take a little break now. But you will, if you sit and then you probably need something, a bite. So if you can distribute these ones, you will eat something which you have never tasted before, except Linda Maria, maybe you've tested it. This is bread that I made this morning, and it's made of 2/3 Kernza. Maybe you spread them backwards when you're ready also. 2/3 of Kernza and 1/3 of wheat. So if we use the expression the British have, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Here's the proof. And remember one thing, what you're eating now is a bread made of flour which has gone, there's no plant breeding whatsoever for taste, for color, for anything. It is simply a wild thing when it comes to, so the breeding has been through making the plant, the seeds big enough so they can be harvested with a combiner. But it's pretty good, isn't it? It has been released, so from 1st of July, it is considered also a commercial. You can actually buy it, the seeds, commercially from the US, from a place called the Land Institute, an institute that we have a very strong collaboration with. but it's still a kind of plant breeding collaboration between plant breeders and farmers. So farmers who are buying the seeds, they also commit themselves to report back to the data on how they manage, what the crop performance, so to establish a link between scientists and farmers. We skip this one. Bread is not the only thing. Beer as well. Long root ale, and there are 4 or 5 breweries in the US now producing beer from Kernza. So it is what is important with this is that the Land Institute has shown there is evidence that it is possible to domesticate a wild perennial grass that many people doubted before, but it is possible. So therefore you have it is commercially available for farmers. The yield is still much lower than wheat, but according to the past experience of breeding, it will take about 25 years before Kernza will have a yield which is comparable with wheat and could probably become even higher. The next one is oilseed. Oilseeds are extremely important in our food system as well, especially since we are using so much of a very bad vegetable oil, palm oil. We need to replace that. And I would like to read from you from a paper from 1934 by 2 ecologists, John Weaver and Anthony Stoddart. The Dust Bowl, probably the most serious environmental disaster we have seen during humanity. 1930s. It resulted in 2 million people migrating from the Central Plains to California and other places. So here it goes. As the weeks passed, this is 1934, as the weeks passed without rain, even the lowlands began to reveal the impact of drought. By August 5, at the end of the continued heat wave, the blue-stem grasses had lost their green color and were wilted and dried even on the lowest slopes. This indicated that the water supply within reach of roots was practically exhausted even on the low ground. A few species, such as, and in the red, Silphium integrifolium, grew normally and stood unwilted above the dried grass. Species with root systems penetrating 8 to 20 feet were little affected. So this is 2.5 to 6 meters. Conventional annual crops, they have a root system rarely below 0.5 meter. Silphium integrifolium has 4 or 5 meters. And according to the main breeder, David van Tassel, who is the one who has sort of pioneered this, it may take until 2025 to achieve yields high enough for commercial production of edible vegetables. But in a future with climate change, it is not only a desirable trait, but perhaps necessary to develop these crops that can grow under such conditions. Legumes. Legumes is a very important type of plants because they can help us to fix nitrogen in the soil and thereby replacing synthetic fertilizers. Did you know that to manufacture synthetic fertilizers takes about between 2 and 3% of the total emission of greenhouse gases in the world are to make synthetic fertilizers, nitrogen in particular. There was a very interesting project, a collaboration between the Land Institute and University of Louisiana, trying to look into the botanic gardens around the world to see are there interesting candidates that could be domesticated. So a systematic study. And in the legume family, there are something like 20,000 known species of the legume family. 8% of them are annuals. All the rest are perennials. Thousands and thousands and thousands of species that can be potentially domesticated. The most important cereal for tropical regions, humid tropical regions, that is sorghum. There is, again, it's similar to the rice, there is a domesticated sorghum which has been crossbred with sorghum halepense, a native or a wild perennial relative, which is also a very problematic weed, sometimes called Johnson grass. You see it if you travel in the Midwest in the US. Every roadside is covered with these sort of Johnson grass. But that is a very hopeful thing. Time is running. So I would just like to end and talk a bit about the research landscape, where I hope Lund University it really is a very important component. As I said, it started by one man and his, at that time, crazy idea. Many people laughed at Wes Jackson when he started his institute. He had a promising career as a molecular biologist in the mid-70s. And instead, he went to the middle of Kansas and started an institute to domesticate perennial crops. Most people thought he was nuts. But nowadays, I don't think anybody would laugh at him. It has grown to a very vibrant research community. So we now count about 41 research groups around the world participating in the development. Everything from genetics, plant physiology, agroecology, and also the social, economic, and political dimension of it. And in Sweden, we have formed some kind of a very informal research consortium. Is that what we call it, Lina Maria? An interest group that consists of LUCSUS at Lund University, the research group on agroecology at SLU, Alnap, and plant breeding at Alnap. So it's Linda Maria here from SLU in Alnap, and Anna Westerberg is a plant breeder from Uppsala. And this is what the agricultural press wrote about the activities that we are engaged in during 2018. Gräsligt intressant. This is from Lund. And this is Anna Westerberg, and this is Lide Hahn from the Land Institute, who is the prime developer of this Kernza. And what is interesting was that in 2018, what kind of year was 2018? If you think about farming, it was dry. So in Anna's fields, there was conventional wheat next to her Kernza fields, and the wheat was completely dead. There was no harvest in some of her plots, and the Kernza was more or less unaffected. In May, we organized in Lund so far the biggest international gathering of this community. And we wrote an op-ed in Svenska Dagbladet. And my vision now is that when our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren perhaps, let's say in 2060, in 2070, in the history class, they will read about the perennial revolution. There was something that happened in the 20s and 30s. 20s, 30s. There was a period, fairly short period, when scientists were able to profoundly change the way we produce food in the world. And by doing so, shifting from annual monocultures to perennial polycultures, scientists were actually able to help averting a very serious climate crisis. Because in 2065, we are on our way to stabilize the global temperature at 1.5 degrees. It was also something that helped solving the ecological crisis in the ocean and in the Baltic Sea in particular. And farmers became so much happier. And farmers started to earn a decent salary instead of 100 kroner per hour. And the kids will laugh and they'll say, how could humanity be so stupid for 10,000 years when it was so simple to do it? That's my vision. And what was a key component of that perennial revolution was perhaps a perennial institute. Can you think about something with the symbolic meaning of it? In the middle of the botanic garden, where we have collection of all these fantastic wild perennial crops and all the knowledge about the botanic world, in the middle of that garden, you have an institute whose idea is to use that botanic knowledge and produce things to save humanity from ecological crisis. That's my little modest vision for a transformation for the future. Thanks for listening. I forgot one thing. I need some help. Can you help me here? And maybe some more. Because this, what you have eaten now, maybe you want to look what it looks like. Can I have one more helper? You will stand in the middle and hold up. So you stand there. No, you can, if you stand there. And then one more in the middle, I think, to... Not done yet, not done yet, not done. Yes, here we are. Okay, so what we see here is conventional wheat, winter wheat, ready to be harvested. And the whole plant will disappear, go away. And we'll have to start all over again next season. This is the Intermediate Wheatgrass Kernza, which is here in its second season. And it will just continue with the root system intact, build on the same root system, add more roots, and it will grow year after year after year without any need to disrupt the soil profile. So that's where the flower you just had, where it came from. So we can put it down here. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, any questions? I think we have a microphone that we can pass around. If somebody has a question or comment or objection or something like that.
Thank you, Lennart, for an inspiring talk. Kim Nicholas from LUCSUS. I wonder if you could comment on any connections you see between the development of perennial grains and animal agriculture, which is often recognized as one of the main causes of the current ecological crisis in terms of land and water use and climate pollution. How do these two systems link to each other?
Yes, that's a very good question. Maybe I should first say that I am not somebody who would claim that we all have to become vegetarians or vegans. I think that animals play an important role in sustainable agriculture, but of course at a much lower level than we do today. Because animals can eat things that we can't eat. But an interesting thing with this Kernza is that it is actually, especially in Australia, they are very fond of it because it's a possibility to, again, integrate livestock and cereal production. The grass was brought to the US in the 1920s because it was seen as a very protein-rich forage crop. So it was a way to make the prairie more nutritious for the animals. And then around 1985, they realized that the seeds were fairly big. So they started to select them. So it is an extremely nutritious forage crop, and it can produce a grain as well. Because we as humans, we can only eat the grains here. We can't eat this. But cows can eat the rest, and they can provide milk for us, and sometimes meat perhaps. So I think it's a possibility to actually go back to an integrated cereal livestock production, which is a much more sustainable agricultural system than what we have today, where you have a specialization. You either grow cereals or have livestock.
Yeah, you talked, I don't know how much you talked about it, but polycultures, these perennials, can they be like grown together or like many species?
Yes. Good that you brought it up, because I probably didn't mention it enough. The idea is to grow these in combination with particular legumes. So almost all the fields are grown together with, or intercropping with alfalfa, or clover, or other legumes, so that they can be self-sufficient with nitrogen at least. So it means that you may need fertilizer in terms of other nutrients than nitrogen, and maybe some micronutrients, but it's a very, very tiny amount compared to what we spread now in terms of nitrogen. Yeah. And also, it's a way to be more pest resistant.
And I have another question. What would you say is the largest challenge for the perennials right now? At what stage in the development?
A very simple question. Money. If you think about how much money that goes into conventional plant breeding within this agrochemical industrial complex, and compare that with how much money that goes into developing these kinds of things, I don't think such small numbers exist. It's tiny, 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 tiny. So the team that has developed, domesticated a wild grass to something that is now commercially released for the first time, Kernza, that is one person, and he has every now and then student assistants. If you compare that with a commercial plant breeding where you have a project to perhaps change the flavor of an already existing variety, you probably have a budget which is 100,000 times bigger than what he needed to domesticate something from wild to this. So money, and also consistency, because plant breeding is a very, very slow process. And that is a problem, because, and if you look at the place like the Land Institute, they have very little funding from the official sources like USDA or National Science Foundation, because all that funding is usually in short, sort of 3-4 year projects, and you can't do much with that. So most of their funding, that comes from philanthropists, people who have lots and lots and lots of money, and they have an idea of they want to do something good with the money. So internet, cable TV companies, that's the most important funding agency for them, and long term. We have a question over there, and then in the middle here.
Okay, for how many years do you think we can grow this Kernza without renew it?
There is an interesting experiment I just heard about in, I think it was Kansas or Minnesota, where they have a 10-year-old field. And the problem is, after 10 years or after 5, 6, 7 years, the Kernza starts to compete with itself, because it's a very, very sort of messy bush. It's not like sort of nice rows. and then it stops producing seeds. So what they did then, they were simply cutting strips in the field, so taking away 50% of the individuals, not digging deep, but just cutting just under the surface. So they took away half of the individuals, and the productivity doubled. So that was the way to get the plant into a mood of producing seeds again, instead of just competing with others. So with this, I would also like to say that there is still a lot of research that needs to be done, of course. So don't compare the performance of this with performance of wheat. Maybe we could compare this with the performance of wheat 150 years ago. That would be more fair. Waiting for the next question, I can also tell you that in Sweden there are experiments outside Uppsala and outside Alnarp, and there is one large commercial cultivation of Kernza at Högestad, where they have 50 hectares of this. They've just harvested the first season, and it was a big disappointment to everybody, the yield. But all the plants are there, so next year they will come back. So it's still very much in the making. Yes?
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for this presentation. I was just wondering, what do you think about organic agriculture?
Organic agriculture is of course a very sound idea. The idea that we shouldn't use toxic things, we should use natural nutrient circulation. But sometimes I see that it is a problem because we have made organic agriculture a commercial brand rather than a scientific principle for how to grow, how to do agriculture. So for example, fertilizers, there's nothing dangerous with nitrogen from a synthetic fertilizer compared to a nitrogen from natural fixation. But if we want to be able to control the dynamics of nutrient availability in the field, it might be beneficial to use a little bit of synthetic fertilizer every now and then, because the natural dynamics of nitrogen is dependent on weather. We can't really control it. So, but having organic agriculture as something where you are absolutely not allowed to use any synthetic fertilizer, I think is problematic. But using toxic chemicals, we shouldn't do that. Or at least that should be in the exceptional case rather than as a normal practice.
Thank you so much. It's a technical question. How do you harvest polycultures? Because like in conventional, they're just wheat and all the same height. So.
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's a simple answer. So, for example, if you grow a legume and a cereal together, legume will have much larger seeds, and this will be very small, and you just separate them using simple mechanics. They blow through airflow, and then the big ones, they will end up here, the smaller ones end up here. So that's fairly simple. Okay.
Yeah, for the uneducated laymen who don't know anything about all these scientific approaches and institutions and stuff like myself, is there a way to get involved in this type of movement? I mean, like volunteering or just being part of it? I mean, again, I'm not gonna sign up for a bunch of courses and wait 5 years. I just have to hint and maybe some time to go and get involved with this. Is there any options for that?
It depends on what you do. But there's one, I think, interesting idea with this movement is also, it's not just about science, but it's trying to establish a new relationship between the science and the users. So if you think about the conventional idea of crop breeding, like the Green Revolution, crop breeding was done by scientists in the labs, and when they were finished, they took the cereal or the seeds to the farmers and then use it. And no dialogue, really. So the idea here is to have a constant dialogue between scientific community and users, because they have both very important knowledge, and they are complementary. So that's why, for example, Kernza is now possible to buy through an office in the US, and they ship all over the world. But you have to sign up to promise that you share your data with them. So that's a way of being, of participating. And that's, I think, the way to go. So if you are into farming, I think there are opportunities. Okay. It's 1 minute to 2.
I'll end by thanking you so much for doing this presentation during the Future Week. There's some sweets for you.
Oh, thank you. What a treat. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming.